Okay, I think it's time to start for today. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to pick up from some of where we left off on Monday, I'm sorry. And we were talking about the labor market in particular. And you might recall, as I mentioned in class on Monday, that we sort of jumped over chapter 4 at the time that we came to it. And my initial plan was to sort of take it in order as it comes in the textbook, and so I designed the syllabus that way. And then as I got into this, I thought, I think I'd rather roll this back to the part of chapter 14, because I think we needed a little bit more background, particularly in the inputs and outputs. And that was sort of my feeling at the time. And I think it's probably the way I'll do it going forward. We only used this textbook a couple of times, but this free online textbook a couple of times. So I'm trying to get a little bit more comfortable with the flow of the material. It's a little bit different than other texts we've been using. In some ways, I miss the old text. But I know the students do not miss the price of the old text, which was, I think, brand new was like $187.50 or something like that. So used was a lot cheaper, and textbooks are just ridiculously priced today. We've got sort of an idea in our department, at least, that we'd like to try to minimize the cost, even if ideally to zero if we can, which is what we try to do here. So, but I like the text. It's just that chapter 4 is a little bit out of order in my opinion, but it doesn't really matter. We picked up some of that. We're going to pick up some additional content today. And we're going to move more into chapter 14, which deals really with some of the dynamics of markets, particularly competitive versus imperfectly competitive markets, that is markets for outputs. And I'm going to come back to this input-output model here in a second. And we'll talk a bit about how wage determination occurs, at least theoretically. And I want to stress at the outset, some of this is really based upon what we would consider the theory of the labor market, okay? And when we talk about this, we'll talk about things like how is the demand for labor derived in terms of the productivity of labor, and I'll get into what I think is a rational way of viewing this, and that is the fact that there are some real difficulties, particularly in measurement, and I'll get to those as we get to it. Then finally, we'll talk about some inequality issues. Your text has lots of content with regard to inequality. We'll talk a bit about racial inequality, particularly in terms of employment, also gender inequality. These have been very much in the news. So again, econ being one of those academic disciplines that I think is very much related to the world in which we live. It's very relevant. And so we'll talk a bit about that. And then we'll get into some just straight data and income distribution data. And that, I think, we'll do it for the day. And we'll move into next week. We'll be getting into some of the final 3 chapters, which will sort of continue this idea of market failure. And by the way, I think when we talk about inequality, I think you could probably make a case that inequality or extreme inequality, particularly that related to discrimination, is in itself a form of market failure. Remember what our overall definition of market failure was the actions of private actors who can't always operate efficiently for whatever reason, or feel like they have a disincentive to operate efficiently. And by the way, your book gets into some excellent, I mentioned him last time, I mentioned Gary Becker on Monday. He was really one of the first groundbreaking economists to talk about the effects of discrimination and the economic, which I think goes back to the 1950s. This is even before the so-called civil rights era, the 1960s, in which he talked about the fact that discrimination itself was irrational and illogical economic behavior. And so I think it was groundbreaking. He won the Nobel Prize for that and some of his other work. And so in your text, I'm not going to talk much about him, but your text, some of that content is very straightforward. So I'm not going to go into great detail unless you want me to. I could certainly do that. So, okay, so that's where we are. And so I'm going to pick up from where we left off last time. Now, I did post the PowerPoint slides into the Brightspace site as of class on Monday. The reason why is because I wanted to put these all together. The original slides that start with types of goods, and I know that that's not really part of what we're doing. That doesn't really go with chapter 4, chapter 14, but I'm trying to kind of keep these a little bit together here so that we can so they better match the discussion in class. And because sometimes this was a fragment, this is a carryover from last week. I just didn't get to before the 3rd exam. So obviously we didn't cover private goods, public goods, common goods, NAPA and national monopolies, but I'll post this right after class. And so I had once I had an opportunity to sort of put all this together and And I think this might be better for you if we do this because, you know, the idea that we keep these in sync with where we're going in class. Okay. All right. So I want to come back a little bit and I want to just circle back to something we talked about before. And it's something that it sounds like it's nitpicky kind of conduct on the part of us in the econ realm. And that is this difference between cost and price. I know it sounds nitpicky, but there really is a big difference. And we talked about this back in chapter versus input costs. And really, it is an important thing to talk about because particularly, you know, and for those of you who will study other courses that will deal with this issue of cost and price, it may come up again, whether you're a business student and you're studying marketing or finance or accounting, and this comes up again and again. This idea of cost is an internal issue. It's internal to the producer. So when we talk about those costs, which are internal, we're talking about what? We're talking about labor, materials, and all that, and whatnot. And in other words, if we go back to these factors of production, which we talked about very early on in the semester, we plan, labor, capital, entrepreneurial ability. We sort of lump all the inputs into one of those categories, and those are very old categories, but they all relate to this idea of what do business firms use to produce output. And obviously cost represent outflows to the firm. And then the price is the exchange value in the market. And we say it's external to the producer, and it also involves the demand side. So this is important in the sense that the price of the goods sometimes is market determined, sometimes it's not. Oftentimes it is market determined. And even in the case of very concentrated industries like oligopolies and even to some extent monopolies, there is a price that's expected that the demand side demands. And as a result, that price is sort of there, and the price is a given. And firms just simply with the price as given. And this relates then, and we'll relate this back to inputs here, because this does. What is the price of the good? This is the price I get for selling the good to the demand side of the market. And therefore, I've got to sort of live with this price in many cases, even in imperfectly competitive markets, as we'll see. Yes, we talked about the fact that monopolies being price makers. Monopolies are kind of rare, really. And even when they do national monopolies, there is government effort to force a price on these monopolies. P&M can't just charge whatever they want for electricity, and New Mexico Gas can't double the price of natural gas. I mean, sometimes it seems like they are raising the price almost infinitely, but there are regulations. So even there's a price that's more or less taken, and we're going to sort of assume that the price of the good is more or less taken in the market, regardless of market structure. Okay, so cost and price are two different things. Also, and I know we're circling back here a bit, we've covered some of this before, but I want to make sure that we all have this sort of locked down in our minds, the difference between inputs and outputs. And on Monday, I kind of gave you this very sort of amateurish flow chart of inputs. There's all the things which go into the hopper to make goods, and we simply refer to those inputs as dollar outflows. And so inputs can be measured, and this is important because it's going to be represented graphically. These are sort of quantified in terms of numbers, the quantity of labor, that is the number of workers, number of hours worked, the number of shifts, whatever you would use to categorize the quantity of labor. But these are numbers, okay? And these are dollar flows. Obviously, they create costs. So inputs create costs, outputs create revenues, and those are generated in terms of dollar flows as well. And then we have the difference between total revenue and total cost. And we're not going to get into the issue of profitability here. We're going to focus mostly on the input side. Okay, we're going to focus on the inputs, and we're going to sort of pick this whole issue up from there and talk a bit about it. Now, we talked a bit last time, and this, I think where we left off was in talking, at least from my notes, that we sort of ended up talking about demand for labor. Okay, we said demand for labor was downward sloping, and we said that, and I'll swivel the camera here so you guys can see it. So it's not all that different really from the market for other inputs. Or even outputs for that matter. I mean, you've got a downward sloping demand for labor curve. And when we talk about demand for labor, and we'll put supply of labor into this mix here in a minute, we've got this issue where we've got, as the wage goes down, people demand more labor. That is a truism. I think that is, when I say people, we're talking about firms. And I think this is important for us to know that as the wage falls, for whatever reason, there are movements along this labor curve are due to changes in wages for whatever those wage changes are. And it could simply be the fact that if there's wage variability, up or down. So movements along this are due to simply changes in the wage itself. So this is not really that much different than the market, any kind of basic model that we looked at beginning in chapter 3. You get the price of the good, the quantity of the good. But those were outputs. If you had PQ and we had the demand for whatever it was, shoes, razor blades, airfare, whatever. This is for labor only, and the price of labor is the wage. And we're going to get into wage determination here a bit later. But we also talked about the fact that these demand curves can shift. You get DL1 maybe shifts to the right to some DL2. Reason, well, let's talk about what some of those reasons are. This is, I think, the very last thing that we talked about on Monday, and that was these non-wage variables. Remember, if we go back to chapter 3, when we talked about demand for some good, whatever the good in question was, we said that what could cause the demand curve to shift? And we said it was due to non-price variables. Well, here the wage is the price of labor. So these are non-wage variables that are causing it. We talked about this idea of labor being derived from the demand for whatever the output is that's being produced. So your text got into an example of the fact that if there's a rise in demand for legal services, there will be a rise in demand for lawyers. Okay, and sometimes attorneys will flock to. I just take that one example. They'll flock to particular areas where there's lots of demand for their services, and we certainly saw them in cases in which there's some disaster and whatnot, and they'll want to sort of flock to that particular area. But it's whatever the good in question is, and it's related. In fact, we could really put an underline by this and put a star by it, highlight it, whatever. Is really, you could say, and that it's all derived from the demand. But there are other issues as well, training and education. So sometimes there, and I put those sort of together there, and sort of skills I sort of broke out as well. And that is the idea that sometimes our demand for labor is because we have to have people with certain forms of education, and in order to do the work that we need to do. Last night, interesting story about what was the company? It's called Virus, I think, here in Albuquerque, where they're involved in doing something, and they are hiring lots of physicists. Well, obviously, because of the work that they do, and they have something to do with space and aerospace and all that. And I didn't catch all of it. I did catch the fact that they were looking for highly skilled people, but the problem is there are only so many people who are trained in physics and have masters and doctoral degrees in this particular area. But when it requires that, they'll increase the demand for it. And if it doesn't require it, then they'll decrease the demand for those particular things. And the same goes with skills. Okay, number of employers. This is simply the idea that you've got. This is simply a function of how many employers / firms / governments, because these are all demanders of labor. How many there are out there? Because it's really it's not really demanding any kind of a good. In this case, the good is labor, and so the number of employers. If the number of employers goes up, obviously they've got to have workers. If the number of employers goes down, they demand fewer workers. If in fact you circle back to this first criteria here, that first criterion, that's the idea of demand being a derived demand. These number of employers are really going to be a function of the demand for whatever good they're providing in the market, in the output market. If people are demanding more pizza, for instance, there'll be more firms providing pizza, and therefore more firms who provide pizza who want workers to make pizza. And I don't have special skills to make pizza, but you kind of get the idea, whatever it is. And so if the number of employers goes up because the demand is derived from the demand for the good itself, then the labor will be a function of that. And if it goes in the other direction, obviously everything reverses itself and goes in the other direction. Okay. The last thing I talked about, and I don't think I really got into this enough last time, was this idea of government regulations. Okay. And I think one of the examples that I gave, which I think is similar to what was talked about in the text, was this idea of sometimes government demanding or requiring that only certain people with certain qualifications do certain activities. Okay. And sometimes they'll mandate. I think the example I gave was of a school psychologist, for instance. I remember my daughter was in school, and it was a different school district, different state. That school district required a school psychologist at every school, required it. Every single school had to have a psychologist on hand to counsel students who were having difficulties at home, difficulties with friends, coping and whatnot. So as a result, they had to go out and hire a bunch of psychologists who wanted to work in schools. That created demand simply because of the fact that the government mandated that. Then same was with these were not nurses. These were different than somebody, skins their knee or whatever. That's a different person altogether that government might require. And I don't recall if there was a school nurse in every school, but I just remember that as being a regulation. And so as a result, a lot of people were, as a result, the labor market response, the supply of labor response was people were studying psychology if they wanted to get hired in one of those occupations. So sometimes government regs require that people have certain skills, and so it requires those. Also, when it comes, and there are all kinds of occupations too that have requiring certain credentials in order to be able to do it. Okay, and obviously not everybody can be a physician. You can't, like Granny or the Beverly Hillbillies, hang out a shingle and say I'm a doctor and I'm ready to treat patients. Right? You have to have certain requirements and meet certain skills and whatnot. So that influences demand for people to do certain things. Only certain doctors, and only certain doctors can do certain activities and whatnot. So a lot of these are regulated by government, and the list of these occupations goes on and on and on. If the government requires an audit, audits have to be conducted by a CPA. It can't be conducted by anybody but a CPA or CPA firm, and that's a requirement. So as a result, the demand for CPAs is directly related to the amount of audits, and in cases in which government requires audited statements, financial statements of contractors, government contractors, it then creates a derivation of the demand for CPAs. Okay. Also, the price and availability of substitutes. This topic here can go on and on and on. And for anybody who is interested, maybe nobody is, but if you're going to take a 300 level econ micro course, we get into this issue quite a lot. This idea of the substitutability of particularly machine goods for people. It's a long running, old debate in economics, and one of the oldest, and that is, okay, how many people do we hire? How many machines do we hire? What is the demand for labor, particularly if we can swap out machines for people? And I've asked this question again and again of students, and I almost always get the same answer. For the same dollar cost and the same relative productivity, if you're an employer, would you rather have machines or would you rather have people? And what do you think it is that students give me invariably, year after year? People versus machines. What do firms prefer? Machines. It has been the story since the beginning of industrialization. And it's not because they hate people, but because of the fact that machines present fewer issues than people do. And they don't unionize, they don't call in sick. They break down. Yes, that's true. But when we talk about substitutes, primarily what we're talking about is capital goods. Going back to that very early definition of capital goods, we talked about land, labor, capital. That word capital is a very old term to describe machine inputs, and firms have preferred machine inputs over people inputs. But we know this. This is no great revelation. Nobody walked in today not being aware that there are many fewer cashiers and whatnot. I was in Walmart the other night. There was not a single cashier. I had to look around, and they were all the self-service, which is fine with me. I don't really care, but obviously there are fewer cashiers. That might be an occupation that goes away over time. So the demand for cashiers will go down because there's a substitute of machines in order to take that place. And by the way, if you look at all these occupations that have disappeared over time, were replaced by technology. Even an occupation, and I know when I was in the business world, we had a little bit of trouble with what to do when Secretary's Day came around, because we had very few quote unquote secretaries, and because they don't really exist except at the very highest management levels. It used to be in the past that even mid-level managers would have a secretary to answer the phone, take messages and whatnot. Today, that occupation really doesn't exist, because if you want to get a hold of somebody and they're not in their office, what do? You call their cell, or you leave them a voicemail, or you send them an email, or whatever, or you text them, you use some sort of digital messaging. There is no need for that person because technology has really cut that person out. So this idea of Secretary's Day is very controversial in a lot of settings, to the point where some firms don't even want to observe it, and it's difficult, because then people who think that they really are secretaries feel like they're being denied the free lunch or whatever whatever it is. And it's a difficult proposition, because the fact that occupation is disappearing, but so have a lot of other occupations. phone operators, used to be many more phone operators, used to be elevator operators, if you can believe it. So some of these jobs are going away. Okay, so substitution, particularly by machines. And then finally, one that's not talked about in your book, but I think is important, is that is the idea of expectations. And that is, we know that oftentimes a function of what the employers expect to have happen down the road. If you think your business is going to do better in the future, in the next 6 months or a year, you might want to start hiring workers now, because it may be too late in 6 months because you train workers. You have to get them ready. If you think the market where your output is going to change, then you need to bulk up on workers now, not what's going on at the present, because things may change. So if you're a construction firm and you see interest rates falling and building permits going up, and you want to take advantage of that, it's a good idea to start getting workers. Now, I don't know how much training there is in construction. I think that's a particular business that you usually come with those skills, or you don't get hired and you sort of learn on the job. That's one of those occupations. But there are a lot of occupations that are different. Programming, and in fact, we at CNN have lots of in particular our STEM center downtown, where we're training people how to program and do the right apps and whatnot, because of the fact that businesses are telling us that we've got an expectation that the demand is going to go on and on and on. And so as a result, because firms are demanding workers with those skills, because they expect the demand for their output, whatever they're producing, to go up, they're going to demand more workers. If it was the other way around, it would go in the opposite direction. So sometimes these future expectations do form a lot of the demand decisions. Okay. All right. So that is demand for labor. What can cause shifts to the right, to the left, whatever the case might be. And let's talk a bit about the supply. I'm trying to move my camera here. I'm moving a little bit slow here. So let's talk about supply of labor. So the thing we should remember here is, remember what we talked about on, we'll get to wages a bit later here. What we talked about on Monday was the idea that the market is flipped here. And when we talk about supply and demand, because when we talk about in the chapter 3, we talked about the idea of supply being provided by firms. Now we're talking about supply being provided by households. So just like demand, which is primarily households, but also firms, when it comes to outputs, here we're talking about the idea of supply of labor being that provided by households. Okay, upward sloping. And why? Because people will supply more of their labor when the wage goes up, less of their labor when the wage goes down. Okay, and by the way, let me say one thing about the term wage here, and that is, in economics, we have a pretty sort of inclusive, expansive definition of what wages are, and because what's going on here is the idea that wages are not just, I mean, I think that there's a tendency to think of wages simply being an hourly wage and whatnot, because we really don't use the term wage to refer to somebody who earns a salary, or we don't use the term wage to refer to somebody who's commission only. We tend to think of the term wage as being a fixed amount per hour, but in economics, we tend to simply refer to it as the cost of labor. And by the way, it can include salaries, which are fixed, wages, which may not be fixed depending upon hours worked, including overtime hours, which are variable often. It can also include things like tips and commissions and bonuses. It can also include things like benefit costs. And depending upon if you want to capture benefit costs. And I know that benefit costs have gone up and up and up and up over the last few years, mostly because of healthcare costs, which are on an upward trajectory, and nobody knows when the rise in healthcare costs is going to level off. It leveled off a bit when the Affordable Care Act was enacted, mostly because more people were paying into healthcare who didn't have health. From that standpoint, I think that President Obama probably does not get enough credit for the fact that at least there was an arresting of the rate of growth in healthcare costs for a time, as more people were entering the market buying health insurance. The point I want to make, though, is the fact that the cost of labor might include health costs as well. And we could do an entire semester or an entire degree program on healthcare economics, which obviously I don't want to do. But the issue with healthcare is very complicated, and it's one that is mostly determined by the private sector. Yes, I know the government is involved in demanding healthcare and paying for healthcare for seniors through Medicare, for those who are needy in terms of Medicaid, and veterans and children and whatnot. But for the most part, it's a private sector activity. Meaning what? Meaning that it gets captured under this variable wage. Okay. And when I say variable, I'm talking about that symbol W. Okay. All right. So again, movements along that supply of labor curve due to changes in the cost of labor. For whatever the reason, oftentimes it's due to a shift on the other side of the market, just like the example that we gave back in chapter 3, something could be going on the other side of the market. When we're talking about shifts to the right, to the left, again, I come back to this idea I've been banging the drum on for weeks, and it's the idea to think about right, left, as opposed to up and down, particularly when it comes to supply, because if you think up, down, a left shift looks like it's actually increasing, or it's actually decreasing. A right shift is an increase. So one of the changes that can cause these, just like in the case of shifts in supply back in chapter 3, for the output market, where it's due to changes in non-price variables, since the price of labor is the wage, we're talking about shifts in the supply of labor being changes in non-wage variables. And the one that is most obvious is number of workers. And this is a particular issue, and that is the idea. Sometimes the number of workers, if it's rising, then obviously we have a right shift in the supply of labor. And if there are fewer workers, there tends to be a left shift in the number of workers. And by the way, this is what it makes micro a bit unique from macro, is in the sense that we can focus in on individual labor markets and find out where workers are moving and leaving. And we see this happening all the time. For labor economists, they focus a lot of times on these regional distributions. And I mentioned geographic dispersion because it's very much related to this. More than ever before, American workers are more mobile than what they ever were in previous generations. And I can even think about your own family and the fact that, a lot of people in the past used to sort of stay put, and wherever they were born, they pretty much stayed put. Maybe they were in the service or whatnot, but sometimes they joined the military and they came back to where they were. Today, that's not so much the case, and it hasn't been the case for a while, but it's becoming even more mobile. And that's the idea that people are moving around to find jobs. And so this idea of mobility is something that really characterizes the labor market to an extent that maybe it didn't. So, and it's both an increase and decrease. So people are leaving parts of the country where the economic opportunities are fewer. And we're thinking about, like the Rust Belt parts of the country I came from, basically, where it was mostly manufacturing based, and a lot of manufacturing has moved offshore, frankly, and so or has been replaced, has used a lot of labor inputs, particularly in the auto industry. I mean, machine inputs, where a lot of auto workers have been displaced, and those jobs aren't coming back, and so a lot of those workers have moved elsewhere, different parts of the country. So there's a decrease in the supply of labor, resulting in an increase in the supply of labor somewhere else. Okay, and also your book gets into this discussion of immigration, which I think is very interesting, and probably doesn't do enough justice to the entire concept of immigration. Immigration is an age-old, centuries-old, millennia-old phenomenon where people are moving around in order to take advantage of economic opportunities. Only now people are not as desperate as what they might have been. It's easy to say, it's not particularly desperate, but there used to be a case in which people had to move simply because of starvation issues. Today, it's mostly the fact of economic opportunity in general, where people are moving around, but almost always it's due to some economic issue. Yes, there are refugees who are fleeing very dangerous areas, but primarily most immigration happens as a result of economic motivations. Okay, so these are sort of tied in with each other, and the number of workers can obviously fluctuate and create shifts to the right, to the left in the supply of labor for whatever market we're talking about, whatever the individual labor market is. Then finally here, and there are probably others as well, government regulations. And this is the idea that sometimes government regulations really influence who enters the supply of labor and who doesn't. And that is the idea that sometimes government, simply creates, and I should also say industry regulations as well. I probably should have added that. Sometimes industry and government together dictate who can enter a particular labor market and who can't. And that is whatnot. This sounds like a demand for labor issue, but it's really not. This is more, this is more focused back on the supply side. That is back to households here. Okay. And the fact is that sometimes you have to meet certain regulations in order to qualify for certain jobs, and you've got to pass screenings. Maybe you can't work for drug-free, for instance. We've seen that play out a lot, and of course that's a big issue now in the states that have legalized marijuana. What do we do when we have employers that have a drug-free workplace, but yet a legal drug that people are consuming. It's difficult. And in fact, the federal government, for its part, still has marijuana as being an illegal substance. And so work for the federal government, I think you're going to still have that sort of conflict. That really determines who can enter, who can't. It's really, it goes back to the number of workers. Also, certain occupations that you've got to meet certain regulations. And by the way, when I mentioned industry, there are certain industries that have what we call gatekeeping behavior. Certain occupations that have long been known to try to keep the gates up, to keep too many people from entering the occupation. One that comes to mind is the medical profession. To be a medical doctor, you've got to go to medical school. And as a result, for years and years, there aren't medical schools popping up all around the country. There are a fixed number of medical schools and a relatively fixed number of seats available in medical programs. And so as a result, they can be fairly choosy, and they have been over time. This is a little bit diluted with immigration, and we certainly have seen that because a lot of Americans, for whatever reason, don't want to go to medical school, but you have to be a medical doctor in order to practice medicine. And so as a result, it's been sort of from an industry standpoint, not so much a government, it's been a sort of a gatekeeping behavior. That's why we have a shortage of doctors, and have had for a very, very long time, no question about it. And it's been a phenomenon which, in order to meet that shortage, immigration has been part of the solution to that. But there are other occupations as well. In fact, if you think about this, and we're going to come back to this when we talk more about regulation from the standpoint of what's called capture theory, that sometimes industries prefer these kind of regulations because they sort of keep the supply down. And we'll talk about, in particular, realtors. And I know there was a discussion in your book about realtors in a different context, but sometimes the realty industry years ago, at least in the state where I was working before I came here, decided that they were going to weed out certain realtors that were simply boosting the supply of labor, interfering with those who were maybe more successful. They were considered to be pests. And so they, the weekend warriors, they sought to drive them out. Those the full-time realtors, by requiring that you have X number of sales and you have to work X number of hours per week. You have to pay a gigantic fee to renew your realty license. And it really drove out, it was a gatekeeping activity to try to keep the supply of labor to the left. If you keep the supply of labor to the left, you keep the wage a little bit higher. That's a gatekeeping kind of behavior. And there are all kinds of occupations, occupational requirements. I should probably add that as one bit on here. That is, sometimes occupations themselves keep people out. And we're not talking here about the discrimination piece per se. You could, it's an issue that may overlap with this, but we're talking about just simply numbers. And as we want to keep the number of doctors down and realtors down, because it forces the supply to the left, forces the wage up. And I know that when I did my master's, we had an actuarial science program that was so difficult to get through that a lot of people were dropping out and going into other areas because the actuarial profession has made it so hard to pass the exams that only a small fraction can get through it. And that's a gatekeeping sort of thing. And that's an idea that, and sometimes keeping that to the left is simply for self-preservation. Okay. All right. Let's put both these together now and talk about this idea of equilibrium. And we'll get to the idea of out of equilibrium conditions in a minute, but let's just simply talk about equilibrium in general. It's not anything too complicated, really. It's just simply putting demand and supply together in the same on the same graph here. So nothing really interesting and different other than the fact that we put demand for labor here, supply of labor there. For whatever market this is, this could be as again, when we talk about microeconomics, we can focus on a big, gigantic market for whatever, pipe fitters in Albuquerque, right? I think that was the example I used last time, or Santa Fe, I think was the example I used. Or we could take pipe fitters in New Mexico, or we could expand at pipe fitters generally, or we could go down to a particular zip codes. It doesn't really matter, but we know that the intersection of demand and supply results in some sort of equilibrium wage and some sort of equilibrium quantity of wage. And so that's considered equilibrium condition, and there is thought to be stability in that particular market. But like all markets, you ought to take a picture of it because things will change because there are shifts to the right, shifts to the left of either supply or demand for whatever reason, sometimes having to do not even with anything modeled here, but in the output market itself. So it's important to keep in mind when we talk about inputs, it's a little bit, this is why I wanted to sort of get through some of this before I got to the labor input topic, was because you have to be thinking about the output market as well. What's going on with the market for the output? I mean, if this is a supply and demand of labor, and the good in question is something like, I don't know, typewriter repairman, right? I mean, that's a market that's probably not greatly in demand because so many people are demanding typewriter repair. So as a result, demand for labor, you've got to think is shifting to the left. Supply will probably catch up usually at some point. Sometimes though, and I know we talk about this in macro, it's not always the case that that the market reacts as quickly as what people think that they ought to. So as a result, you have to think that that would be a market that is sort of shifting and bringing the wage down, and ultimately it'll hit the axis and go to zero. Okay, but whatever the good question is, or whatever it creates demand for labor in particular occupations. Okay, so this is an equilibrium condition, but what about conditions out of equilibrium? We've got some. Let's see. I think we talked about the shortage first here, so let's cover the issue of shortages. So what is a shortage? It's simply a condition in which the quantity supplied of labor is greater than the quantity demanded of labor. Okay, so any kind of a shortage is simply the case in which what you've got a difference where you have too much demand for labor and result to the quantity supplied of labor, and so as a result, the difference between those two areas here is considered to be a shortage. Quantity demand of labor exceeds quantity supply of labor, and you've got a labor shortage. On the other hand, what about a condition of a labor surplus, where you've got the quantity supplied of labor exceeds the quantity demanded of labor, and now you have a surplus, which is the difference between these two elements here, as opposed to the shortage there. Okay, quantity supplied of labor being greater than quantity demanded, and this is the surplus. Surplus and shortage, and those are both out of equilibrium conditions. Okay, so that is not particularly different than what we have talked about before, but I want to talk about minimum wage, because this is one area that is very relevant to what we're talking about here. And that is in one of the areas, particularly whenever we talk about labor, I don't think we can really get out of talking about minimum wage, because it's just a topic that really never ends. And it's very controversial. And I can tell you that I know that I think probably the average person thinks that economists disagree more than what they agree on things. And that they can never, I know Harry Truman once said that he really wanted a one-arm economist because they kept telling him on one hand, on the other hand, on the one hand, on the other hand. And so he really wanted this idea of trying to have some definitive resolution. In reality, I think economists agree on a lot of things, but this is one area there's disagreement. Wage, it's a mandate. It goes back to this idea of government deciding that there's a normative value of labor. Remember, normative is this idea, normative topics are this idea that whatever the market price is considered to be not price from a social standpoint. So the idea of the minimum wage is we're going to set the minimum wage here, okay, in order to raise the wages of those who are deserving of the minimum wage. Again, it's a normative judgment. And so really it's a form of price control. It's a form of price floor that we simply call a wage floor. Now, remember, what are we talking about? When we think about floors, remember, don't think about floors as being down there, think about being up here. And that is the idea that we're going to raise the wage because of the fact that workers are being underpaid. Okay, so this is a normative judgment. Now, this is where all the trouble begins, because some economists are saying, okay, look, there's a reason why this is the market wage. It's the equilibrium wage, right? And as a result, firms will hire an equilibrium quantity of labor based upon that wage. To raise that wage means what? We're going to have more people do what? Enter the labor market to capture that higher wage. Meantime, firms are going to say, you know what? I can't afford that many workers. And so as a result, we've got a gap here. This labor surplus, right? The surplus in labor really basically means that we have a rise in unemployment. Rise in unemployment. Now, this is a theory. I'm not saying this that you should take this to the bank and say this is the case in all occasions. In fact, what's really interesting of all the topics in economics that the economists are surveyed on, this is the one that every so often economists are surveyed by journal publications that publish articles and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about the minimum wage? And there's no agreement as to whether or not unemployment results from the increase in the minimum wage. Because if you just look at it from a graphical standpoint, yes, you would think, okay, we're popping the wage up, and so as a result, yes, you have people entering the market to capture that wage, competing against those that wouldn't have competed else otherwise because they wouldn't have supplied their labor. Meantime, a firm that would have hired, maybe 10 servers, at a restaurant, maybe dials it down to 8 servers. And by the way, I know that we saw this argument when Santa Fe raised its minimum wage. We heard, the news media went around talking to restaurants saying, I'm going to hire fewer servers and fewer bartenders because I can't afford that wage. And by the way, I'm probably going to go out of business and whatnot. I don't think there was a great number. This was well before the pandemic. This has got nothing to do with the pandemic. It was years before that. And I don't think there were too many firms shutting down as a result of that. There was only one that I really heard of it. There was even credible explanations because of wage costs. Okay, here's what makes this controversial. Okay, so think about the market wage and whatever the market wage is. It assumes, first of all, that the minimum wage is higher than the market wage, and that therefore the market wage is too low. Here's the problem. First of all, let me just ask you, what is one big problem that may be staring you in the face if the minimum wage is, and I'll just go with the federal minimum wage, $7.25 per hour. Okay, I know that's higher in New Mexico, it's higher in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, I know that. But let's just say that we're saying the minimum wage is that. What is the problem with that dollar figure in relation to this whole graph? And that is what? Well, first of all, who works at minimum wage? Who are we talking about primarily? Pardon? Kids, yeah, mostly kids. I mean, I say kids not because I'm trying to make this age specific.
Undereducated.
That's very unskilled, but it's usually, and I bring up, you mentioned kids, that's probably good. But a lot of us were in that situation. I mean, I know when I started as a kid in the labor force, I earned the minimum wage. And at the time, frankly, the manager of the grocery store that I worked for said, you probably aren't worth the minimum wage, but I got to pay you this wage. And so he felt like he had no choice. So he was very blunt about that. Most adults do not work anywhere near the minimum wage. We know that because of the fact that if you take the minimum wage times 40 hours a week times 52 weeks or however many weeks of work, it comes in to be well lower than the median wage in the country. So it's primarily very unskilled workers, very entry-level wages. And, it doesn't really represent where most adults are in the workforce. And this may be one explanation for why there's a lot of teen unemployment. But there are other explanations as well that have to be factored into the whole teenage unemployment number, which is many times higher than it is for the adult population. Because when we talk about unemployment, which I know is more macro in nature, but there are different means by which we segment the labor force. And one of those is we just simply take out teens altogether. We just don't count them. And we go with the 18 to 64 workforce. Because the thing about teens is, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I worked as a kid in high school, 16, 17 years old, there would be people who would quit because they couldn't get off on Friday. They wanted to go to a football game. They couldn't get off. They would just quit. Almost no adult is probably going to do something like that. I mean, I'm not saying it never happens, but you get lots and lots and lots and lots of turnover, and it's usually not some human tragedy if a 16 or 17-year-old leaves their job for whatever reason, or they have trouble showing up, or there's a conflict with school or whatever. And so there's lots and lots of turnover. So the idea of the minimum wage is very controversial because it's the idea that most workers are up here anyway. They're not down here, but they're up here. So therefore, remember what we said about price floors in general, is that it's not binding. It's only binding if it's above the market wage. The market wage for most workers is up here. This may only apply to the very lowest skilled workers who are earning minimum wage. And I want to make clear that we're not talking about the quote unquote living wage that's discussed back in chapter 4. That's a different discussion altogether. And the living wage it's almost a term that you really don't hear much anymore, but it was where market wage was so low, particularly during the Great Depression, that people couldn't even make a living even at that wage. And there was no such thing as a minimum wage at all. The living wage is an entirely different issue altogether. If the minimum wage is probably not a living wage anyway, but it's also not particularly relevant to most workers. Most workers earn something above it. And by the way, we've seen and renders minimum wage laws mostly ineffective because minimum wage keeps going up, but so does the wage. And so as a result, the average wage outpaces the minimum wage. to the point where the floor is not really binding. So if it's not binding, how can it create unemployment? So that's one issue. And I know that economists disagree and disagree vehemently, but I think it's fair when we talk about any economic theory or phenomenon that it's fair that we talk about this idea of disagreements in the field, because I think that it is not fair to say that the economists agree on every subject. So I thought we'd sort of mention that. Okay. All right. So questions about any of that? All right. I want to talk a bit about, I want to sort of circle back to this idea that we talked about before. I think this slide was one, it was either identical or very similar to what we talked about when we talked about the market for outputs. But it's very similar here when we talk about inputs, and that is something this topic known as marginal product. Okay. All right. So what is marginal product? Well, first of all, the term marginal simply refers to incremental. In this case, it's the incremental amount of output. Okay, it's the incremental amount of output, and when we talk about something known as the production function, it's this relationship between the value of inputs and the value of outputs. Or if not the value, we think of value as being a dollar figure. You can take the quantity of inputs and the quantity of outputs. Okay, and either one is simply a reflection of the production function. So the marginal product is the change in output or total product divided by the change in inputs. Inputs are defined as labor, which is L, or capital, which for whatever reason is called K. I suspect that's because whoever created this model was a German speaker, and so that was so K has been used for whatever reason, probably because C is used in a lot of other places. So labor, so all these could be whatever the input is. And the fact of the matter is that marginal product is a diminishing function, and it reflects this overall general concept everywhere in economics known as diminishing marginal returns. And we talked about this several weeks ago when we talked about marginal returns. And we said, look, I think most of us have long ago been aware of the fact that there is this phenomenon known as diminishing returns. Okay. And that is the idea that things diminish over time. And whatever it is, in fact, there are lots of diminishing functions everywhere in life. And we hear this term in everyday life occasionally when somebody says, okay, I went to the gym for 8 hours today, right? That may be too much, right? You may, after the first hour, you're getting a certain amount of benefit. You're getting the second hour, you're getting positive benefit, but not so much. And maybe third hour, fourth hour, whatever, it's just going down and down and down. In other words, the incremental benefit that you're getting from it. So as a result of this, if you're talking about the addition of labor into the production function versus the marginal product, again, we're talking about here about numbers, right? You know what, let me make this a little bit smaller here. Let me make this a little bit smaller, squeeze into what I'm doing. If we're talking about the input of labor here, and we're talking about the output here, we're talking about the marginal product. And what do we got going on here? We've got the marginal product of labor curve that looks something like that. It's diminishing in nature. It's diminishing. Why is it diminishing? Because what's going on is this. You've simply got the fact that as you hire more workers, the theory is that as you hire more workers, you get less and less incremental benefit. So if, for instance, you have 12 workers being hired, and you might get a certain amount of incremental input. You hire maybe fewer workers, you get marginal benefit. I'm sorry, yeah. So I'm sorry, 2 workers, 3 workers, etc. The amount of marginal product goes down. The total product goes up because you're adding more workers. It's the incremental benefit that goes down. And what's the theory of this? The theory of it is, it's very simple, and it may be familiar to anybody who's worked in a place in which there's doubt about the number of workers being there. Is that, well, let's just go back to the example that I used when we first started talking about inputs and outputs. And that was the example of a business that has 1 worker. And that 1 worker has to do everything. Okay, they have to answer the phone, sweep the floors, clean up, lock up, help customers, all those kinds of things. And so it makes sense to hire another worker. And then that worker shares tasks, and they overlap at times. Maybe you're more productive, and maybe you're actually output revenue. That's true, but incrementally you're not producing as much. And you hire a 3rd worker, you get even more overlap. And so as a result, what happens is you have overlapping responsibilities, and the dynamic is, and I know that may sound a little bit unscientific and maybe even a little bit unfair, is that the more people you've got in a workspace, the more back and forth chatter there is. and less work gets done. And I can attest from my own experience that even in settings in which we have difficulty at measuring marginal product, like a service setting, you get people in a space together. And I think I told the class, when we first started talking about this, that there are occasions in which, maybe you come in on a Monday morning and everyone wants to talk about football the day before, and then, it's suddenly 11 o'clock. Well, let's just go to lunch, and then we'll come back, and we get back at 12:30, and we've lost half a day because all we did was talk about football. If you didn't have people to talk to, you wouldn't have that. By the way, now I bring this up because this is interesting that some firms are finding that with the work from home thing, that some workers are more productive than what they would have been otherwise. And one theory of this is because of this idea that maybe this is from home, that is, you don't get as much diminishing marginal product, but you also don't have that much addition of workers, because of the fact maybe you have another person come by or whatever. But it's the idea that, how much time is wasted in the workforce when people stop by your desk or chat, or they're getting coffee and they're talking and they're wasting time. Some workers are finding they're more productive, and they're actually lobbying employers to let them work from home. And some employers don't buy it. And this is another area where there's disagreement, because some firms are saying, how do we know you're actually working? Particularly if you're being paid an hourly wage. I understand that. How do we know you're working when you're working from home? How many hours of the day are you actually walking your dog, or making lunch, or picking up your kid from daycare? I mean, you get the idea. How do you know? Well, I guess you can only know by judging the marginal productivity, however you measure that. And by the way, I'll say at the outset that when we talk about all this theory of we're working our way to wage determination, all this assumes that we can calculate productivity on a marginal basis. But what's the difficulty there? The difficulty is that there are some occupations that becomes very difficult to capture productivity, particularly in service occupations. Now, there are some that maybe aren't quite the same, like maybe if you're in a call center, number of calls you get, maybe you work at Dallas call center and you're getting phone calls, and they can measure your productivity and how quickly you get people off the phone and whatnot. But a lot of service occupations, it's really difficult to know, and every case might be different. If you're a skin knee is going to be a lot less time consuming than a patient with something really difficult and complicated that you've got, and multiple problems that you've got to deal with. It's difficult in service occupations to track this. And so some of this is quite theoretical. Okay. But the idea is that there's a diminishing amount of productivity that occurs as a result. By the way, I know that it looks like it's all, to the negative, but in fact, what's really happening here is you've got this kind of thing going on. You've got total product actually is rising, but it begins to tail off. And so the total product of labor actually is rising until it can actually become negative at, let's say, I don't know, 6 workers or whatever. Maybe we get out here and it's 6 where it becomes the intercept and it becomes actually negative. And so that's the reality. Sometimes you get no additional productivity. These workers are adding value, but they're adding value at a much slower rate. And that's really what diminishing functions. You get this diminishing thing happening. Okay. Questions about that? I want to, and hopefully I get through this, because what I really want to, hold on a second. Oh, you know what? I think I did not get what I'm doing. I don't think I captured that I think I had the camera in the wrong place there. But for those of you who are watching, I hope you got that. I think my camera's in the wrong spot. I've got diminishing marginal. I apologize for that. I'm trying to do better at being aware. The intent anywhere is somewhat new. So this is the marginal product diminishing function. Total product rises, sort of levels off as marginal product of labor incremental output goes down. Okay. So I apologize for that. Maybe you can stop it and draw that if you're looking. I apologize for not being aware of that. Okay. All right. Well, this is all very interesting, I guess, or not interesting, whichever you prefer. But I want to really talk about. Sorry, I lost my. I hit the wrong button on this. I get way out of focus, and I'm trying to bring the camera back here. Sorry about that. And we'll zoom back in. And zoom back in. Zoom in. Okay. So I want to talk about wage determination here. So, and I want to talk about the theory of wage determination. So what are we talking about when we talk about wage determination? Well, first of all, there's a reason why, actually there's a reason why I wanted to sort of defer the whole labor piece until we got through some of the conversation about market structure, because what's really interesting about wages is the fact that wage determination is determined a little bit differently in perfectly competitive output markets versus imperfectly competitive output markets. And it really does make a difference. And so if we're talking about perfect competition, so remember perfect competition, which you thought you were all done with, right? Is this market structure in which firms are basically price takers. They produce primarily the same amounts of outputs. Remember, perfect competition is an output market, okay? But there are some issues that are very unique to this output market that determine wages within the input market itself. And that is this: the demand for labor is basically equivalent to this. Demand for labor is basically equivalent to the marginal product of labor times the price, and it's the price of the output. It's the price of the output. So demand for labor is basically saying that, again, this is the theory behind this. It's the idea that demand for labor is a function of the numbers being produced times the dollar amount of the output. Okay? The dollar amount of the output. That's what the demand for labor is equal to, theoretically. If you can determine the amount of productivity that somebody's creating, and again, you have to be consistent in this. What are we talking about? By month, by week, by hour, whatever the case might be, or even by what kind of grouping we have by work unit or whatnot. Sometimes firms will lay off entire work units because they find that productivity of those work units are not where they ought to be. Times the price of the output being produced. Well, what we're talking about here is we're talking about simply this. We're talking about the value of the marginal product of labor, which is essentially equal to the marginal product of labor times the price. And so if these are equal to each other, we say the demand for labor is exactly equal to what we call the value of the marginal product of labor. The two are one and the same. So the value of the marginal product of labor is basically expressed as a dollar figure. Because why? Because remember, one of the things that we said back in, I think it's chapter 7, was the idea that in economics, whenever you have a dollar figure multiplied or divided by a number, you're going to end up with a dollar figure. So the value of the marginal product of labor is what a laborer is worth. Okay. And I hate to say that because it almost sounds, I don't know, callous, I guess, when we talk about the value of labor. But think about this too. It's not just that firms don't want to pay higher wages. Sometimes they'll pay higher wages if they think the value of the worker is higher. And by the way, if you follow sports at all, I find this to be an interesting and fascinating market, because the fact that you've got workers here who command extremely high wages. And the big question is, what is the value of their labor? And like right now, there's a big negotiation going on in football over Lamar Jackson, quarterback for Baltimore, who was a former MVP, but has had some injury problems. He wants to put himself on the market. He's negotiating a higher wage. His team is saying, you know what, we won 2 Super Bowls without you. You've got injury problems. Maybe we don't want to pay the wage that you think that you're worth. And so it's a big debate. But whatever happens, he's made a gigantic wage, way higher than the average wage. And we know this. I don't think there's no secret that professional athletes make more than the average worker. But the idea is that because he's earning such a high wage, it's the question of how much of a wage is true. And by the way, I'll finish up this sports analogy in a minute. We're seeing the opposite thing happening in baseball. Why? Because if demand for labor is a derived demand, what about the demand for baseball? People don't watch baseball anymore. It's really a sort of a declining sport. And so we may be looking at a peak in salaries where players are signing multi-year contracts just to lock them in, because the feeling is because people aren't watching baseball as much, maybe the demand for their services is not going to be rewarded as much. And by the way, there are a couple of outlets that were carrying baseball games that filed for bankruptcy just recently because there isn't enough viewership. And so it's a declining sport. Remember, all demand for labor is a derived demand. So as a result, people aren't going to, and who knows what's going to happen in baseball. The problem that baseball has is the idea that the average viewer is like 52 years of age. Well, that's not exactly very promising, because in 20 years, 30 years, they're probably all going to be gone. So once we get younger people in that market demanding the output that is baseball, then who knows what's going to happen to the wages there. That's a perfect example. Even though these people are very highly compensated, we will maybe see the peak wage and then go down from there. And by the way, we see this happening. If you just take that example, which a lot of us are familiar with sports, workers can sometimes play it wrong. The hockey players thought that their wage was quote unquote worth more than what the owners thought it was. They went on strike a few years ago, and it turns out it was a disaster for the players. They didn't get anything that they really wanted at all, and they lost a whole season's worth of wages because it turns out nobody thought that they were worth as much, because not that many people watch hockey. If I ask people in this room, how many of you watch hockey? Probably not very many, probably not many, especially in parts of the country where there's no real culture of that, okay? All right, so demand for labor. So demand for labor, we know demand is a downward sloping curve. Well, what are we really talking about here? We're talking about the value of the marginal product of labor, which is a dollar figure, right? Value of the marginal product of labor, and the quantity of labor, if we put on this particular axis here, we know the value of the marginal product of labor is this sort of downward sloping curve, which is basically equivalent to demand for labor, okay? And this is actually the, oh, you know what, this should say marginal product of labor, okay? So it's downward sloping from there. But here's what's interesting about the perfectly competitive market is that if you've got this kind of quantity of labor issue here, and you've got the wage, because here we have, now we're going to get into the wage issue, where you've got this marginal product of labor curve that's downward sloping like this. If in fact it's a perfectly competitive market, okay, the wage is going to be whatever the wage is going to be, because if the price is taken, so is the wage, and so the wage is mostly market determined. So the quantity of labor is mostly market determined. So in a perfectly competitive market, there's not much variability in the wage. Okay, and so again, remember, we go back to perfect competition, and we talk about who competes. What is perfect competition? The output market is goods which are mostly the same. They're undifferentiated. One product is the same as another. And so if we're talking about people who work on farms and whatnot, there's not lots of variability. There's not a lot of negotiation for the price of labor. And in fact, you know, a lot of this is unfortunate, but a lot of people don't want to do farm labor. And so as a result, farm wages are pretty low. And so are the prices of farm output, simply because of the fact that there's competition for the provision of those. I was looking at some agricultural statistics last week, for instance, and it turns out the grain market right now, take corn, for instance, one of the most basic outputs, the price is expected to go down because there are more farmers entering that particular market, and productivity is going up. So as a result, the supply of corn is going to go this way, driving the price down. And so as a result, if the price goes down, the price of the output goes down, it's going to drive down the value of the marginal product of labor, which is the same as the labor curve, which is going to keep workers' wages down. This is why you almost never hear people say, hey, I want to earn more, so I want to go work for a farm. It is very low wage labor, no question about it. And a lot of these jobs that are very low price and low output and no differentiation of the output pays relatively low wages. That's just simply a reality of the labor force. Okay. All right. I was going to get into the imperfect competition. I don't think I'm going to have time, but I do want to. I'll let you read that on your own. If you want me to cover that on Monday, I can. What I wanted to get into was this. I want to talk a little bit. I think it's important for us to talk. Oops, shoot. I want to talk a bit about. Get rid of that. Okay, here we go. There we go. I want to talk a bit about the earnings gap. Okay, and this idea of unequal wages, because one thing that I think is important that we recognize is that a lot of this idea of wage determination is theoretical in nature. Okay, it's theoretical in nature, and as a result, you know, why do we have such differentials? Now, by the way, this is in your book, but I like this slide. I don't usually pick out slides out of the textbook because I think it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy for you to just read it on your own. But I like this one because this basically takes, this is a percentage, and let me scroll this down a little bit. This is race and gender, the two criteria by which discrimination are most manifest in the labor market. And we know this because labor economists have studied this particular topic for years and years and years and years. In fact, we see this particular time series begins around 1970. And so if there were equality, we would see that the black to white racial disparity be non-existent, would be at 100%. There wouldn't be a disparity. And in fact, one thing that's very depressing is the fact that this has remained relatively stable in terms of of compensation of black workers to white workers being less by about a quarter in terms of wages. One thing that is a bit more promising is the idea that the male wage rate has gone up. There is still a gap. If 100 is here and the gap is right here, as of, I guess, whatever the year is when this stopped, 2010 or whatever the time series stopped, then it would still be there. But that's smaller than where it was there. And so females are gaining in income relative to males, where the gap was much bigger. In fact, it was much bigger than even the racial gap. So that is happening. And there are a lot of explanations as to why this has been the case. You can almost say without a doubt that this was because of labor force discrimination. No question about it. By the way, there was a department that I went to as an undergraduate. We had an economist who won the Nobel Prize. Her name was Eleanor Ostrom, who did not, her background was in political science. She wanted to study economics in graduate school. And when she went to UCLA graduate school, they said, no, we don't admit females into the graduate program in economics. Today, that's insane, but this is the way it was back in, I think, the 60s when she tried to get in. So she studied and got her doctorate in political science, but really wanted to get into economics. And so as a result, she did a lot of work on local government economics and eventually was a Nobel Prize winner. But that's an illustration of the fact that there's no question there was just outright unapologetic, I guess, discrimination that one time happened. And that's falling in many, many cases. Here, it's a little bit more complicated. I think certainly discrimination has been the case, and probably it's still going on. But there's no question this is just the raw data from the Census Bureau itself. So this is a little bit depressing. If anything, maybe that gap is opening up a little bit, whereas this is beginning to improve. So it's an issue that really deserves a lot of discussion. And I know that in my macro courses, I say to students, in this century, I think probably the biggest three areas that are going to be of studying economics is this idea of income inequality and issues concerning global income inequality. That's another issue because these issues are magnified in other parts of the world. And then also issues, which is off topic, seemingly about water issues are going to be big ones. But there's no question inequality looms large. Now, by the way, I'm going to show you, I pulled these up last, hopefully these will be easy to see. This is something called the Lorenz curve. And the Lorenz curve, let me explain how this works here. Let me find what I'm looking for. Okay, here we go. So this is what's called the Lorenz curve. Max Lorenz was an economist. This is over 100 years old, where he basically said, look, if we put household distribution of cumulative households, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80% of households, we tend to measure these by quintiles, but in this case, you've got a percentage of households and then the cumulative percentage of income. If all households earn the same amount of income, we would all follow this line of equality. So the bottom 20% of households earn 20% of the income, next 20%, 40, 60. So this line of equality, which basically bisects this right angle, which is any graph, right? Any quadrant in a graph, if we were equal, we would all line up on that line. Well, we know that there's no inequality of income, but to the extent there's bowing outward, it represents inequality. What does it mean? It means that the bottom 20% of households earn about 5% of the income. This is the United States data as of 2020. I pulled the census data as of 2020. It took me a while to find a graph. It was easy to see. Whereas if you look about the 10% of households make 45% of the income. 10% of households make about 45% of the income. Income is wildly dispersed, and what is even more depressing, which is why I say this is going to be an issue that's going to be widely covered, I think, by economists, is this. Let me find the graph I'm looking for here. It's not that. It's not that. It's where's the graph? I'm having trouble finding one. It's that. Okay. So to the extent that there's bowing away from the line of equality, it represents inequality. This is 1974 data. This is 2014 data. And as a result, we're becoming more unequal as a society. This is US income distribution based upon census data. Census data is pretty darn accurate. And so as a result, we're actually moving away from equality toward greater inequality. And so the question is what to do about it. And I guess the other part of that question is, should we do anything about it? And I think a lot of people think we should, but there's no good answer as to what we do about it and who's going to be responsible for doing it. One other thing, and this is off the topic a little bit, but it's related, That is, if you think income inequality is extreme, then take a look at wealth inequality, if I can find it here. Wealth, and this is data from the Federal Reserve. That's not it. If I can find it here. I'm having trouble with these screens are not easy to work with. Oh, geez. Let's see. There it is. That's it. This is for the Federal Reserve itself. It says Investopedia. I actually went on the Federal Reserve website. It comes from the Federal Reserve as of 2019. This is wealth distribution. This is, if you thought the shocking and depressing or whatever, look at wealth distribution. Wealth is all that's been accumulated over time. The bottom 20%, bottom 40%, basically the bottom 50% have almost no wealth. This is cumulative percentage of wealth. There's almost no wealth at all. In fact, it may even be negative in some cases. And we go up to here, and the top 20% have 80% of the wealth. 20%, the top 20% have 80% of the wealth. Maybe that's shocking, maybe that's not shocking, I don't know. But what is very shocking is the fact that lower income households have almost no wealth. And when I say lower income, we're talking about 3/5 of the population has essentially no wealth, and it's all concentrated in the hands of a few. So the question is, why is this even more unevenly distributed? Remember, the greater we bow outward from the line of equality, it represents more inequality. So this is even more bowed outward than the income distribution. And one reason why is because the wealth tends to be often, not always, but sometimes inherited. And so there are people out there, particularly in this top quintile here, the top 20%, who have inherited wealth that was earned decades ago. And so as a result, they've got lots of wealth. It has nothing to do with their skills, it has nothing to do with their income. It's just simply the fact that a lot of wealth is inherited and passed down, passed along. And this is why we've got greater inequality of wealth. Now, what to do about this is if you think the income inequality, income distribution inequality is difficult, this is even more difficult as to what to do about it, because there's almost no appetite, at least in our country, this is the best data as to trying to level this playing field at all. Things like the estate tax, which has been proposed, that doesn't really apply to very many people at all, only the very highest. And so, so this is something to really think about, this idea of inequality. Okay. All right. Well, I think I'm out of time here. It's 10:44. Any questions for me about what we talked about today? Okay. Well, I didn't get to the imperfectly competitive market. I know I was running a little bit late on time. I'll try to get to some of that on Monday, but otherwise we'll move on to the next topics which relate to market theory. So if I have any questions, meantime, get with me over the weekend. Also, you wanted to hear about the exams. Once everyone's taken the exam, we will cover that on Monday, presuming that everyone has have a great weekend. See you next time.